never been economically viable to bring mongongo nuts to your local health food store. But that's one of the things you learn, okay? So you also learn where to get water, how to get water, you learn how to share, you learn how to be a member, right? You learn, and it's not all nice, it's not all clever. You learn that if you have to make a sudden migration across 500 miles of desert because of drought, and you have a newborn, you leave the newborn behind to die, right? Because the mother will not survive, nor will the newborn. If she moves on, she gets to the new watering hole, and if there's enough water there, she'll have a baby within the next 6 to 9 months, right? And the group will survive. So these are natural responses. I always like to throw that in because it's very, very important to understand this is not sentimental. It's not like, oh, we should live like the Kung and everyone will be happy. It doesn't work that way. The Kung live a very, very specific kind of existence in response to the environment, and that's what's useful about studying them. It's not that we want to be like them. We want to see how the organism responds naturally to the kinds of things that force them to make responses to the environment. In keeping with that, when we look at function of the orgasm, for instance, groups like the Kung, or any number of other humans in nature, as we see with many primates in nature, expressed very, very clearly and openly, and I thought this was always wonderful when I started reading, like how much this dovetailed in to my studies in those areas. Sexual expression and the sexual organization, the expression of sexual life in these groups is not particularly problematic or particularly dramatic. It's seen as it's seen very much as much an expression as hunting, gathering, and in fact, actually in Richard Lee's analysis of how much time, for instance, Kung, and this is always fascinating, right? Everyone assumes that these poor humans in nature spend all their life just barely surviving. It turns out when you study it, these individuals spend about the approximate time of, they don't use days the way we do, but it's about 2 days a week to meet all their needs for a week under normal circumstances. The rest of the time is spent largely hanging out and primarily focused in on the very fast, among the Kung, on a very fascinating practice called the trance dance, which is a non-chemically induced, vibratory dance pattern triggered by intensive diaphragmatic breathing, in which they describe energy then beginning to enter the body and boil through the body, right, and heal. I actually had a friend, an anthropologist friend, who worked and actually was trained in this interesting experience. They also believe that during these relaxing times, the other best pastime, right, is sex play and sexual activity. And the view of sexual activity applies to, and sex play applies to all members of the society, from the earliest, the youngest children to adults. The only thing, that is sad is as you get older, they commonly talk about the fact that you don't have as many opportunities for sex, and that means it's not as much fun, anymore to live, right? But as far as children are concerned, there is no distinction about sexuality in childhood, what we would call adolescence. There is no adolescence, pre-puberty and post-puberty sexuality. Post-puberty sexuality becomes, and this is important too, Reich was also very clear that it's not that you have no rules or no conditions for the way sex is organized, but what you want is a rational organization, rational rules. So among, for instance, hunters and gatherers, sexuality post-puberty, right, becomes significant, right? Because then you have the possibility of impregnation and reproduction, right? And therefore it's important to the group that your sexuality be more organized for the social significance rather than just simply the play or the individual experience. But nonetheless, up until this point, if we look at the level of expression in what we call the second point here, the second leg to the left, or the third, that a natural social and cultural environment would produce a series of conditions optimal to the expression of tension, charge, release, or the function of the orgasm, as Reich came to call it, right? Or the natural pulsation. But inevitably, as history produces, and Reich, according to anecdotally, although he says this, I think, in correspondence, but Dr. Sobey reports that Reich felt that the single most devastating impact on the human organism in changing all this was population growth. Okay? And that as a result of this, you begin to get increasingly complex pressure on developing organisms, and you begin to see the possibility that this function of the orgasm, or this natural pulsation through the organism, can be expressed into a natural sexual pulsation, which would be a positive and healthy and certainly desired goal. Or it can be blocked. That becomes a whole other area. What causes these blocks, or the armoring of the organism, is something Reich spent probably the rest of his career constantly examining and trying to understand, and certainly what we were talking about today, or at least in an overview. And understanding that whatever that is, and you can ask questions about it or make comments about it, but for my purposes, let's just assume that for whatever reason, these blocks begin to become chronic or organized, and probably has something to do with increased pressures through population growth, meaning the more people you got, the more rules you have to set in motion, the more conditions, the more things you have to know to be a member, right? And when these blocks become chronic, right, if we follow this out, they begin to produce a armored or a blocked sexual function. In other words, the natural sexual pulsation no longer is operative, or isn't operative in an efficient or productive or reliable way. This can also produce very, very high levels of anxiety. We see that as individuals in simple societies there are numerous ethnographic studies that show us individuals in very simple natural societies become increasingly pressured and increasingly threatened by the circumstances of their lives in nature. They express in their societies higher levels of organization in response to anxiety or competition or stress. This produces new kinds of rules and regulations or things you have to know to be a member. And this produces what I think Reich means by the armored sexual function. You see this, and Reich is very adept in his response to Malinowski's work on the Trobrians, in pointing out that already in the Trobriand Islands you're not seeing a genitally driven society. You're really seeing a society that's already armored, but and I think the issue of the big issue of the priest and ruling class versus the earlier groups. The less hierarchical groups. Is already an expression of that kind of process of blocked, armored sexual function. And what you see in the Trobrians, but what Reich was fascinated about, and this has to do with what was available. In the Trobrians and in Samoa, based on Margaret Mead's material, you're seeing groups that basically see sexual function as pleasure and as having very, very few rules until you have certain social responsibilities based on class or based on reproduction. But beyond that, you're pretty free to explore. And the most visible thing which Reich found the most interesting, of course, was the Trobriand tradition of creating not just huts, but basically children's villages. And the children's villages are very poorly understood by particularly Western thinkers. It's assumed that these are, places where kids go off to play doctor. They don't. These are literally satellite villages that are supported by the adults, basically only to the extent that the adults make sure they're safe, physically, and are given food, enough food, to sustain themselves. Beyond that, the attitude is largely do what you want to do, learn what you have to learn, and then when you're ready, come back and you become an adult member. Basically, it's determined by rites of passage.